Oklahoma Gardening is a production of the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service as part of the land grant mission of the Division of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at Oklahoma State University, dedicated to improving the quality of life of the citizens of Oklahoma through research-based information. Underwriting assistance for our program is provided by the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry, helping to keep Oklahoma green and growing.
Today on Oklahoma Gardening, we are continuing to look at pruning methods as we work to get some of our plants back into shape. I'll share with you how to grow your own microgreens at home, and horticulturist Laura Payne will share with us some gardening tips as we anticipate spring.
The third method of pruning is called shearing, and typically when we're talking about evergreen shrubs, whether they're small or large, such as this one we have next to us, we're looking at shearing these as far as pruning them. So we're not necessarily going to go in and look at individual branches. We're going to reshape this in order to maintain whatever shape we're looking for. Sometimes we're talking about small evergreens that have more of a spherical shape. It might be a topiary that's got several spheres to it, or something like this that's more of just a hedge. Now you can do this and kind of maintain more of a natural structure, or it might be that you're wanting to maintain more of a pyramidal look. So one thing that's happening here is you can see on this north side where it's getting a little more shade, we've got some upper growth that is outgrowing the lower growth. And that's the biggest concern, is when you are pruning something that's a large hedge, you want to make sure that the bottom is always wider than the top. That's so that that bottom growth can still receive plenty of sunlight in order for it to still continue to grow. If the top gets wider, or if you prune it so that the top is wider than the bottom, then that bottom portion is only going to lose that sunlight and again just sort of deplete, and kind of, as you can see here, it's a lot smaller down below. So we're going to try to bring this back up to shape, and there's a couple of methods you can do. If you want to use hand shears like this, these work really well. And in this method, we're just going to go in and kind of give it a haircut. We're not necessarily looking at individual branches. What we're looking at is more of the profile of the shrub. So you can see here, if we're looking at the profile, we're going to take off a fair amount of this material right here in the middle. So these shears work well if you have a small project or you just want some physical activity. But if you have a large hedge, you might want to invest in a power tool. You can get battery ones or gas powered. Both usually work really well. Now be mindful though that when you start this up, they are going to make more aggressive cuts quicker. So you want to kind of get a good feel for how to do this. Again, we're just going to kind of step back and look and try to follow the silhouette of this, being mindful that we want the bottom to be wider than the top. We've got it trimmed up, and it's a very natural but pyramidal shape. So again, we're not going for that formal tight look. We do have some voids here a little bit, but we've opened them up so that they can get more sunlight, and hopefully we'll allow those branches to grow out some. You know, depending on your branches or your shrubs that you're looking at, everybody's going to have kind of a different pruning style. So you might want that more formal look. If we were to make this in a more formal look, I would have to take this back even more severe in order to make up for those voids that are in here. This has a little bit more of a natural look. This is a Christmas jewel holly, which means it's going to have sort of a natural pyramidal look, so it doesn't need a lot of pruning. And that's one thing that's in another segment. It's important to have the right plant for the right place. So if you're wanting something that has that pyramidal form, make sure that you're getting that plant that naturally has that, so it reduces how much pruning you're going to have to do. So again, if you're out looking at pruning up some of your plants, keep in mind whether it's blooming on old wood or new wood. If it's blooming on old wood, wait until after it's bloomed. If it's blooming on new wood that's going to come out, then it's okay to go ahead and prune that in late winter, early spring. Again, looking at the different types of pruning methods depending on what you're looking at pruning. Thinning is taking discrete cuts inside that and intentional cuts inside a plant, making sure to kind of reevaluate that shape. You always want to step back and look at anything you're pruning. Heading is another form of pruning where we're going to just basically cut the main stem off or cut the whole plant off and rejuvenate that. And finally, shearing is a great method to clean up those evergreens.
As we move into the spring phase of gardening, here are a few tips to keep in mind. One is that we always think about starting cool season vegetable crops indoors, but you can also start your cool season flower crops indoors. Okay, not all plants transplant well. So you need to read the seed packet and make sure that you can sow those seeds indoors and transplant them outdoors. Some plants that are transplantable are nasturtiums, sweet pea, and stock. So something else to keep in mind this time of year are your birds. So it's time to get your bird houses all cleaned out and get your feeders full. And I just want to demonstrate for you this neat little funnel scoop that you can put your seed in and then directly fill your feeder. Just like that, our feeder is full. So another little tip that I want to give you is this handy little tool right here. And this, you can purchase this wherever you purchase your pruners. But this is the easiest way I have found to sharpen my pruners. So you just take it and just a few swipes across your blade, and that will sharpen your blade. So I suggest that you keep your tools sharp and clean during your gardening season to make your gardening go a lot easier. Here are some more gardening tips for the month of February and March.
If you've ever been to a fancy restaurant, you might have noticed a little edible garnish put on top of your steak or another dish that you've got in your entree. And what that garnish might have been was microgreens. We're going to show you an easy way to grow microgreens in your home, and you can do it all year round. And in fact, it doesn't take a lot of effort, and like I said, it's pretty simple to do in your home. There's a couple of things to keep in mind, and that's the light, as well as the ventilation, and also which type of garnish you want to grow or which type of microgreen you want to grow. So the first thing that you're going to need is some sort of container. You can buy a cute little container like what we have here. We just picked these up at a nearby hobby store. This one actually comes with a plastic liner in it. Of course, we're going to need to drill holes in this, or you can do something like this that's just a big dish. Again, this already has holes in it. So we're going to go ahead and drill holes so that we have plenty of drainage in our decorative container here. All right, now that we've got our holes put in here, another thing you can do, because this one already came with a liner, we didn't have to worry about that, but if you were worried about protecting your container, you can just use something like a old plastic sack and actually line it that way. Again, you want to make sure that you have some holes to allow for drainage. Also, when you're selecting a container, it really doesn't need to even be this deep. One that's only about an inch or two will actually work for microgreens because we're not going to be growing the plant for very long, and so they're not going to have very many roots to produce. Once we have our container ready to go, what we're going to then do is fill it with some pre-moistened potting soil, or I should say potting media, because this does not have any actual soil in it. Just to reduce your amount of pathogens that can spread to your greens, you want to use something that doesn't contain any compost or soil. So this is just a mix of potting media. Sometimes that media can be hard to get wet initially because it might have some sphagnum moss in it and things like that. And so by moistening it ahead of time, you know that you've got it good and wet throughout. Again, you can see it's not, you can't squeeze any water out of it. It's not saturated to that point, but it is moist. Once we have our soil filled in here, or our potting media, because there is no soil in here, filled in our box, then it's time to figure out which seeds we want to plant in here. Now, if we're looking at cool season crops, they can handle a little bit lower temperature for germination than warm season crops, but all of them do really well in the range from 65 to 75 degrees, which is often the average home ambient temperature. So that's why I said this works really well. You just need to make sure that you have a good sunny window. Another thing to consider when you're picking your seeds that you want to select is as far as the germination time. Well, here you can see we've got a couple of different plants mixed in together. We've got some radish and then some sweet peas and then another type of radish here. And so some plants will germinate within 10 to 15 days, which is relatively quickly, and that's when you could harvest them. And some need about another week longer, 16 to 25 days. And so radishes tend to germinate a little bit faster than, say, carrots. And so that's one of the reasons why when you're harvesting, you want to make sure that you're able to harvest the whole crop at once. If you're concerned about mixing, then you might just pick one container and stick with one seed in that. Herbs are another plant that you can use, but they're going to again take a little bit longer until you germinate. We actually have a few herbs that we're going to plant together here. We have some cilantro and some dill, and then a globette basil. So we're going to plant this with a few different herbs. So as we harvest that, that'll mix those microgreens together to add to our garnish. Another thing to think about when you pick your seeds is the actual flavor that you're trying to achieve. So of course, because they're microgreens, their flavor is going to be really rich, a little bit more intense, and it's also very densely packed with nutrients. So we're just going to sprinkle these seeds across the top here. You don't want to do them too densely because again that will reduce the airflow. So we're going to divide this up into thirds here, basically. So we've got our cilantro on this end, and then we're going to plant some dill. Normally, dill is a plant that you would not plant in something this small and narrow because it'll get a couple of feet tall. Because we are just after the microgreens, as soon as it germinates in about 15 days, we'll be harvesting this shortly after that. So again, this works out really well to put dill in there for a microgreen. And then finally, we're going to put some globe basil in our last section here. Then of course we want to make sure that we label our plants that we put in there, just so we know again what seeds are coming up. And also to keep track of how long it takes to germinate. That's important. And also as you're kind of sampling them, you can see when you have the optimal flavor that you're desiring and know as you go through the future when you should really harvest those microgreens. So the last thing that you want to do is just to make sure that you get seed contact with the soil, and you're just going to press your hands on that soil and the seed to ensure that there's good contact there. So we pretty much have it all done. We're going to go ahead and water them lightly, just again to make sure there's good contact. You want to use something that's not going to really wash your seed. So again, probably don't use a hose, just a mist or something like that. A little sprinkler will work fine. And then at this point, we are concerned about the humidity. We want to make sure that there is a lot of moisture around these seeds as they're trying to germinate. So there's a couple of ways that you can do that. You can use plastic by putting a plastic tent over these, and that will help create that greenhouse effect. If it's something smaller, like what we used here, that we call this kind of our salad bowl, and in fact this is a recycled take-home container that we actually germinated using the lid. Now, of course, as these start to germinate and you see that sprout come up, you're going to need to remove the lid. And also keep in mind that any sort of warm day that you have, that can really accelerate the heating process in here. And in fact, it can heat up so quickly that that will actually kill any seedlings that are starting to sprout. So you have to be cautious with that. Something like this, where we've got some microgreens lettuce growing in here, we could have started those by putting that whole container into a Ziploc baggie or something like that. So again, using a baggie on something like this will just allow that humidity to stay high and promote that germination. And again, we used a decorative container, but there's no reason that you couldn't use something like a flat with cell packs in it. And in fact, these are really great, again, because they allow for the amount of depth that you need. And we've got this just on a cooking sheet here. And the nice thing about this sheet is you can water from the bottom and allow that water to be soaked up through the plant. And the nice thing about that is, again, you're reducing the amount of splash that might occur on that foliage, reducing any chance of pathogens getting onto the foliage that you're going to be eating. Now again, you can almost use any sort of vegetable or herb as microgreens, anything that's edible. So here we've got some onions, which will give you more of an onion flavor. Again, the radishes are going to give you more of a hot, spicy flavor to it. And another factor to think about when you're planting your seeds is the color and the texture that you might want to add to your dish. And so you can see that there's some different red colored lettuce and also some red stem radishes that you can get. And again, that's just going to add some variety and some interest to your meal when you're using these microgreens. So at this point, we're ready to harvest. We have a lettuce mix here that is definitely a microgreen. You can see how small they are. Typically, you're going to harvest your microgreens when they're only 1 inch to 2 inches. So we're just going to come in here with a pair of snips, and you want to cut right above the soil line. Again, trying not to interfere with that soil to reduce any chance of dirt getting onto your plants. So here we have some radishes, and if you look at these, we have 2 different types of leaves. So here we have the seed leaves, or the cotyledons, and then we also have the true leaves, which are the leaves that actually look like a radish leaf. So these are a little bit almost past being a microgreen, but they're definitely still edible. They just might be a little off on their flavor. So again, that's why it's important to take notes as you go through so you know exactly when to harvest. And believe me, a day or 2 can make a difference in how quickly your microgreens grow. So we're just going to come in here and harvest again right above the soil line, taking the cotyledons and everything. Now, because we are harvesting these plants at such a young age, you really are only getting 1 crop off of the seeds that you grow. So for that reason, after we harvest this container, we'll want to go ahead and change the soil out and plant a new seed crop in here with either the same seeds or different seeds depending on what we want. But the nice thing about microgreens is that you can continue to plant another crop and have succession planting. That way each week you can harvest. Now you can see we've got our microgreens. We're going to take these back and just wash them thoroughly. You want to be gentle as you're handling these because they are somewhat fragile. They won't last quite as long as what our fresh cut lettuce, mature lettuce would last. These are only going to last probably about 5 to 10 days in the refrigerator. So that's where your succession planting will help to ensure that you have another crop to use for your next meal. So if you're looking for a great way to dress up your next dinner party, try growing your own microgreens. Espalier is a form of intense pruning where we actually train a tree into a 2-dimensional form. You might see this out in the open on some wires or up against a brick wall. It's a form that actually dates back to the Roman era, and there's a lot of reasons why you might espalier a tree. One is for the aesthetic value. So it does add a lot of vegetation into a vertical space that might not otherwise be covered. Another way or reason why you might espalier something is to capture a microclimate. So a lot of times fruit trees are trained into espalier forms, and so it allows you to grow fruit trees into a very narrow area and potentially capture, if it's up against a brick wall, capture that radiant heat in order to produce more fruit. Now typically fruit trees are espaliered, but it is possible to do some other trees as well. We have Kiefer pears here, but the one thing, if you were to use apples, apples tend to have a softer wood longer, allowing it to be more flexible in order to tie that down. When we first started this process, I'm going to come down here and look at this tree. When we first planted it, like a lot of fruit trees, we actually cut back that stem to where we wanted to establish that first cordon or that canopy to establish. This is a normal practice that you do with fruit trees, and again, it can be a little scary to just cut the top of a tree off, but what that does is it initiates some of these side shoots to start growing, and we want to direct that growth outward onto our cordons. So the first year we cut that off, and that season we got new growth coming out, and we trimmed everything except for these two, and then we trained them and tied them onto this first cordon. We did take one of those shoots and redirect it as our new leader, also tying it to this second cordon. So the second year, as we come on up, this shoot that we trained to be our new leader, we did the same thing. So again, we topped it off, and it allowed for new shoots to grow. We trained one going out each direction on the cordon, and a third one to again be our new leader. So you can see each one of these is a year. The third year we did the same thing. So we didn't get our cordons trained soon enough or tied down, and so that's why there was a little bit of an arch. It was sort of hard to bring them down. And we do have some sucker growth here, so we're going to go ahead and cut these back because these are not going to do anything but create a lot of vegetation here. We want to maintain these growing outward. Now, last year in the gardening world, it got away from us like a lot of things, and so we didn't actually get out here and trim this like we should have to train that new growth. So as we look at this, it's not too far past that we can't still go ahead and produce some new sprouts. So we're going to cut this, and when we make this cut, we want to make sure that we're cutting it above the buds that we're wanting to sprout. So we have a sprout on this, or a bud on this side that we're going to hopefully get to grow this direction. This bud will train onto this cordon, and then this bud will be our new leader. So we're going to go ahead and trim this off, and later on this season we're going to see a lot of these shoots develop, and we'll be training those along this cordon. So on our next tree here, we have a very similar situation. You can see this little defect. This happened because we didn't get out here and tie this one down. The thing about Espalier is they require a lot of regular checking and training. So because this one didn't get trained and we had to get another sprout, it kind of made this elbow here. Now that there's no vegetation, you obviously notice it, but once there's some vegetation on here, it's not going to be as noticeable. What we do notice here and want to take care of are these water sprouts that have come up from the first cordon branch that we have going across here. So we're going to go ahead and remove those so that they don't distract from our overall form that we're trying to create. Now, again, something you want to keep in mind as you're doing this is whatever structure you're using, you want to make sure to have that trellis in place before you actually plant your plants, because it's nice just to have that to grow on. We've used this 4-cordon wire system, which works really well. And again, there's different styles of espalier you can do. You can do a candelabra, you can do a fence style, you can do this horizontal look that we've done here. But regardless, when you're setting up your trellis, what's nice on these wires is to put in a turnbuckle so that you can actually tighten this wire as it might soften in the heat or as it gets more weight on it from the fruit tree. And that allows you to create more tension to really support that tree. So regardless of whichever style you choose, you want to make sure that you're constantly, regularly I should say, looking at directing that growth of those sprouts, especially as they're still supple. Otherwise, you might have some deformations. We have just used some of this horticultural tape in order to train those and tie them to our cordons and make sure that they stay where they're supposed to be. But in the wintertime, this sort of creates green flags all over your plant. So something that we have found that's a little more discreet are these black kind of rubber band-like ties. So you can easily kind of wrap this around and it ties within itself, and it will hold that plant and doesn't cause any harm on that bark. So it's a nice little discreet way to tie that cordon to your wire. But espalier is a fun way to try to incorporate fruit trees in what might be an unlikely tight space.
There are lots of great horticultural events this time of year. Be sure and consider these activities when you're making your plans for the weeks ahead.
For the next few weeks, OETA will be adjusting their regular schedule for fundraising. However, you can continue to catch best of shows on the OETA World Digital Channel and, of course, on YouTube. Join us back here on March 20th when we resume new episodes of Oklahoma Gardening.
To find out more information about show topics, as well as recipes, videos, articles, fact sheets, and other resources, including a directory of local extension offices, be sure and visit our website, oklahomagardening.okstate.edu. And we always have great information, answers to questions, photos, and gardening discussions on your favorite social media as well. Join in on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can find this entire show and other recent shows, as well as individual segments on our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. And tune in to our OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel to watch segments from previous hosts. Oklahoma Gardening is produced by the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service as part of the Division of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at Oklahoma State University. The Botanic Garden at OSU is home to our studio gardens, and we encourage you to come visit this beautiful Stillwater jewel. We would like to thank our generous underwriter, the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry. Additional support is also provided by Pond Pro Shop, Greenleaf Nursery and the Garden Debut Plants, the Oklahoma Horticultural Society, and the Tulsa Garden Club.